In the summer of 1770, the air in Lafayette County, Virginia, was thick with the scent of ripening tobacco, a crop that promised prosperity to those willing to work the land with sweat and blood. Among the sprawling plantations and scattered homesteads, the Hargrove estate stood as a symbol of wealth, its red, bricked manor perched atop a gentle hill, overlooking fields that stretched like a green ocean. The master of this domain, Colonel Thaddeus Hargrove, was a man whose reputation preceded him, not for kindness, but for ruthlessness. Colonel Hargrove was a figure whose presence could unsettle even seasoned neighbors. Tall, gaunt, with eyes that seemed to pierce through pretense, he maintained order through fear rather than respect. Yet, within the walls of his estate, there lingered a darkness more intimate than any gossip could convey. For Thaddeus had a sister, Eleanor, frail and pale, whose health had always been precarious. Born with a delicate constitution, she was a shadow of life, almost ethereal, moving quietly through the house like a ghost. The Hargroves' neighbors whispered about Eleanor, noting the colonel's obsessive vigilance over her, yet also a cruelty disguised as care. Some claimed he loved her, others suspected his motivations were far more sinister. It was in the spring of 1770 that the truth of Thaddeus Hargrove's character would take a grim form, a story that would be whispered for generations. Eleanor's condition worsened that year. No physician's treatment, nor folk remedies, could ease her suffering. The colonel, faced with the mounting costs of care and the potential loss of his estate, if he maintained such a fragile charge, hatched a plan that would shock even the most hardened inhabitants of Lafayette. It was decided that Eleanor would be auctioned, sold to the field hands, the very laborers who tended the tobacco with relentless devotion. The idea was not merely practical in the colonel's eyes. It carried a macabre fascination, a sense of control over life and death that Thaddeus found irresistible. On a humid June morning, the plantation's yard was cleared, and the field hands, sun-baked and weary, were summoned. Colonel Hargrove, in his finest attire, presided over a scene that would haunt the memory of every witness. Eleanor, dressed in a tattered white gown, was presented not as a sister, but as a commodity, her pale hands trembling, eyes wide with terror. The bidding commenced. The men, uncertain whether to obey or protest, offered coins and promises, each hesitant to seal such a grotesque transaction. The colonel, merciless and cold, accepted the highest offer. Eleanor's fate was sealed, and the field hands, bound by obligation and fear, took her into the scorching heat of the tobacco fields. It was not long before rumors began to swirl. Stories of a hex that the colonel had whispered reached the ears of nearby neighbors. It was said that in a quiet, secluded room, Thaddeus had leaned over Eleanor and spoken words that twisted the air itself. An incantation or curse, no one could say for certain, but the effects were immediate. Within days, the crops in the Lafayette fields began to wither. Tobacco leaves blackened at their edges, stalks bent under unseen pressure, and the sweat of countless laborers seemed to nourish nothing but ruin. The field hands, desperate and frightened, whispered among themselves of a spectral presence, an unseen hand that burned the leaves even as they tried to tend them. Some claimed they saw Eleanor wandering the fields, her eyes hollow, muttering in a voice that carried through the night like the rustling of dry paper. Others swore that shadows moved independently of the men, encircling them with silent menace. Colonel Hargrove, however, remained undisturbed in his manner, inspecting his estate as though nothing were amiss. To outsiders he appeared composed, a man of discipline, yet within the grand halls a different scene unfolded. Servants spoke in hushed tones of Eleanor's cries, echoing through the night, of furniture mysteriously overturned, of doors slamming in empty rooms. Even the colonel's own quarters were not immune to this phenomenon. Papers flew from desks, lights extinguished themselves, and an oppressive chill lingered where Eleanor had once been. The first harvest of the season was a disaster. The Hargrove estate, renowned for producing some of the finest tobacco in Virginia, yielded crops that were brittle, scorched, and utterly unsellable. Traders who had previously courted the colonel with eagerness now hesitated, sensing misfortune in the very soil of Lafayette. The whispers grew louder. Was this divine retribution, or the result of the colonel's whispered hex? No one could say for sure, but the pattern was unmistakable. Wherever Eleanor's presence touched the soil, decay followed. The field hands, now haunted and guilt-tridden, tried to continue their labor, yet the land resisted. Tobacco that had been green and promising one morning would blacken and crumble by afternoon. Animals on the estate grew skittish, refusing to graze in areas where Eleanor had worked. Even the wind seemed to carry a mournful sigh across the Hargrove fields. The colonel, for all his cunning, was not impervious to fear. Though he maintained a facade of calm, the nights brought him visions he could not dismiss. Shadows danced along the walls, forming shapes he recognized but could not confront. A voice, faint but insistent, whispered his sister's name. No lock, no guard, no decree of law could contain the force that now seemed to inhabit the estate. By summer's end, the Hargrove estate had become a place of whispered legends. Travelers avoided the roads leading to its gates, and even neighboring planters, wary of scandal and superstition, kept their distance. Colonel Hargrove's actions had not only condemned his sister, but also unleashed a chain of events that he could not control. The Lafayette fields, once fertile and thriving, were now cursed in the eyes of those who lived to tell the tale. As July bled into August, the Lafayette tobacco fields deteriorated further. The once vibrant green stalks now seemed to droop under a weight invisible yet palpable. Field hands whispered of a strange malaise, a creeping sickness that did not afflict men alone but tainted the soil itself. Those who worked alongside Eleanor reported seeing her figure at twilight, gliding silently among the rows of dying plants, her eyes hollow, a silent accusation etched upon her pale face. Colonel Hargrove, consumed by his desire for control, refused to acknowledge the supernatural. He consulted doctors, alchemists, and even itinerant mystics, seeking remedies for the blighted crop. None succeeded. One physician, an elderly man with a shock of white hair and trembling hands, examined the soil and declared it poisoned not by nature but by intent. The colonel dismissed such words as nonsense, yet the fear that had begun to creep into his own heart could not be ignored. Meanwhile, Eleanor, now confined largely to the fields under the supervision of the laborers who had purchased her, appeared strangely unaffected by her new life. She spoke little, but her gaze carried an intensity that unsettled all who met it. Some claimed that when she walked among the tobacco, the leaves withered even faster, and a faint, acrid scent accompanied her movements, a smell like burned paper mixed with earth. Strange events multiplied. At night, the manor resounded with sounds no logical explanation could satisfy. Doors slammed without wind, furniture toppled, and servants reported hearing soft footsteps on stairs that led nowhere. Even animals on the estate became agitated. Horses refused to enter the stables, dogs barked at unseen figures, and poultry scattered in terror. The colonel, who prided himself on discipline, attempted to impose order, yet the house itself seemed to rebel. One evening, in a rare moment of vulnerability, the colonel confided in his oldest friend, Major Jonathan Price. They sat in the dim light of the drawing-room, the summer air heavy and suffocating. "Jonathan," Thaddeus whispered, "I fear I have invoked something I cannot control. My sister, she is no longer merely human. The land, it burns beneath her touch. I cannot stop it." Major Price, a man of pragmatism and some superstition, considered the colonel carefully. "Thaddeus," he said slowly, "you meddled with forces beyond reason. You treated a life as a commodity, and now the consequence is upon us. The fields, the house, they speak of injustice, of vengeance. Do not think you can outsmart what has been wronged." That night the colonel attempted what he called rectification. He stormed into the fields, lantern in hand, shouting at Eleanor to return with him to the manor. The field hands hesitated, but fear of the colonel's wrath compelled them to obey. Eleanor, however, did not resist. Instead, she followed silently, her expression unreadable. When they reached the edge of the fields, the colonel turned to confront her, but the lantern flickered and died. In the pitch darkness, the wind howled, carrying the faint, mournful sound of a woman's cry. The next morning, the crops appeared even more scorched, as if the night itself had passed over the land in fire. Tobacco leaves were curled and blackened, soil cracked and barren. The laborers refused to enter the fields, claiming that Eleanor's presence had awakened a fever in the earth. Rumors spread that the colonel's whispered hex had bound his sister's essence to the land, transforming her frailty into a force of destruction. As the weeks passed, Eleanor's health mysteriously stabilized. Her once feeble body now carried a strange vitality, and her eyes glowed with an intensity that frightened even those who had long known her pale demeanor. The field hands, already unnerved, began to speak openly of seeing her at odd hours, walking through the crops as though inspecting them, murmuring in a language they could not comprehend. Colonel Hargrove's demeanor changed. He became increasingly reclusive, wandering the halls of the manor in silence, consumed by paranoia. He would stand at the windows for hours, watching the fields, muttering threats to the soil itself. Servants avoided him, fearing sudden fits of rage, while the major traders and neighbors gradually withdrew from interaction. The Hargrove estate was becoming isolated, not just geographically, but socially, haunted by the very act that had once seemed practical to Thaddeus. Eleanor's influence extended beyond the fields. Within the manor, portraits of ancestors seemed to weep, candle flames flickered without wind, and mirrors reflected images that were not present. The colonel, desperate to assert control, attempted to confine her to the upper floors, but each attempt failed. Doors locked themselves, windows refused to close, and servants reported hearing Eleanor's voice calling from the grounds below. By September, the Lafayette tobacco fields were largely abandoned. What remained of the crop was worthless, and the whispers of neighbors had become full-blown tales of a cursed estate. Some believed that the colonel had been consumed by his own ambition, that his decision to auction Eleanor had invoked a wrath not of this world. Others murmured of witchcraft, of pacts made in secret and payments exacted in blood. Amid the fear and superstition, a curious pattern emerged. The more Eleanor worked in the fields, the more destructive the environment became. The colonel, witnessing this, attempted to flee the estate, but every attempt met with inexplicable setbacks. Horses bolted, carriages broke down, and sudden storms forced him to return. It became clear that Eleanor, once a frail and passive figure, now commanded a force that anchored him to the land he sought to dominate. By late autumn, the Hargrove estate was a place of whispered horrors. Traders who dared approach the gates reported seeing shadows moving independently of any human, hearing cries that chilled the blood, and smelling a strange, acrid smoke over the fields. The colonel, for all his discipline, was reduced to a man haunted, pacing the halls like a caged animal. He knew deep down that the whispered hex he had once spoken was now irreversible. The legacy of the summer of 1770 was clear. A crime of cruelty had unleashed consequences far beyond human reckoning. Colonel Thaddeus Hargrove's ambition and cold pragmatism had transformed a frail sister into a symbol of vengeance, a force that scorched the Lafayette tobacco fields and isolated the estate in a shadow of dread. What began as a calculated act of economic expedience had become a tale of horror, whispered for generations, a warning of the cost of treating life as mere property. By the onset of October, the Lafayette estate had transformed into a place of eerie silence. The once lively grounds now lay under a blanket of decay. Tobacco fields that had promised prosperity were blackened and brittle, the soil cracked as though scorched by an unseen flame. Birds no longer perched on the fence posts, and even the wind seemed to avoid the estate, carrying an unnatural stillness. Colonel Thaddeus Hargrove moved through his manor as a shadow of the man he once was. His gaunt features were drawn tighter each day, and his eyes, once sharp and commanding, now flickered with dread. He rarely spoke, and when he did, it was in fragmented mutterings about contracts broken, debts unpaid, not of coin, but of moral and spiritual consequence. The field hands, too, were transformed by their ordeal. Those who had once labored with resignation now spoke openly of Eleanor as a force both human and otherworldly. She walks in the dark, one man confessed to another in the flickering candlelight of the servants' quarters. And the land, it bends beneath her footsteps. You can see it with your own eyes. Tobacco blackens where she passes, and even the air smells like fire. Whispers spread beyond the estate. Traders from neighboring counties who had once sought the Hargrove tobacco for its quality began to tell tales of a cursed plantation, stories of strange lights in the windows, unexplained cries, and fleeting glimpses of Elena roaming the fields at night circulated in local taverns. Some believed the colonel had become a sorcerer, practicing dark rites upon his sister, while others murmured of witchcraft, vengeance, and divine punishment. The colonel, aware that rumors threatened his social standing, attempted to assert control. He forbade anyone from speaking of the events outside the estate, threatening punishment for disobedience. But the more he tried to silence the tales, the stronger they grew. Eleanor's presence had become a silent witness, her influence extending beyond the confines of the plantation. Even letters sent to distant relatives carried an inexplicable weight, the paper sometimes scorched at the edges as if touched by the hex itself. One stormy night, the colonel decided to confront the power he had unleashed. Determined to break whatever force held the land in its grip, he entered the fields alone, lantern in hand, seeking Elena. Thunder rolled across the hills, and rain lashed the ground, yet the fields remained strangely dry in certain patches, as if shielding themselves from the deluge. He found Elena standing among the tobacco, her white gown plastered to her form, eyes glowing with a spectral light. She looked at him, not with fear or sorrow, but with an intensity that rooted him in place. Her lips moved, but no sound came, yet the colonel understood the words as clearly as if they had been spoken aloud. You traded what was sacred for what is trivial. You sowed cruelty, and now the land reaps it. The wind howled, and lightning split the sky, illuminating her figure in ghostly brilliance. For the first time, Thaddeus felt true terror. He realized that Elena was no longer merely a victim of his cruelty, but the embodiment of the very vengeance he had set in motion. The fields, the manor, the laborers, all were conduits of her power, the land itself alive with her will. Over the next weeks, the estate descended further into chaos. Tobacco fields lay ruined, animals grew sickly or fled, and even the household staff began to desert the property, unwilling to endure the constant oppressive presence. Traders refused to enter, fearing that the estate itself would bring misfortune. And through it all, Eleanor's figure haunted every corner, her presence an unrelenting reminder of the cost of Thaddeus's cruelty. Colonel Hargrove attempted to reclaim authority through intimidation and violence, yet each act seemed to empower the force he sought to control. Windows slammed shut of their own accord, furniture overturned without hands, and an unearthly chill permeated the manor. Servants reported seeing shadows moving independently, whispers in languages unknown, and objects levitating briefly before crashing to the floor. The community, once indifferent to the affairs of the estate, could no longer ignore the tales. Local clergy visited the Hargroves, offering prayers, blessings, and warnings. They spoke of sins against the innocent, the moral debt incurred by enslaving and auctioning a family member, and the power of curses spoken in despair and rage. Yet even sacred rites could not quell the presence that had taken hold of the Lafayette fields. Elena, however, remained calm, almost detached. Her frailty was gone, replaced by an aura of command that radiated through the estate. She did not seek to harm indiscriminately, but wherever she moved, the land and its inhabitants bent to her will. Some laborers claimed that if they approached her respectfully, the fields appeared less hostile. If they feared or mocked her, the crops withered instantly. By November, the colonel's despair had become palpable. He was no longer a man of authority, but a prisoner within his own estate, haunted by whispers and shadows, by the land he had tried to control. Elena, now both sister and spectral force, remained the arbiter of his fate. Each day that passed, the Lafayette fields became a testimony to the power of vengeance, a living monument to cruelty repaid. The story of the colonel and his sister began to spread beyond Lafayette County. Travelers spoke in hushed tones of the cursed estate, of the figure of a frail woman transformed into a force that bent nature itself, of a man undone by his own greed and cruelty. The whispered hex, once merely a superstition among the laborers, had become legend. And in the darkness of the Hargrove manor, as autumn turned to winter, Colonel Thaddeus Hargrove came to understand the truth he had long denied. that cruelty, once inflicted on those most vulnerable, could never be contained. The land, the sister, and the spirits of justice itself would always find a way to reclaim what was owed. The Lafayette tobacco fields lay scorched, abandoned by men, and left to the mercy of the one they had wronged. Eleanor's presence lingered, a silent testament to the consequences of human cruelty, a haunting reminder that some acts cannot be undone, and some debts demand retribution beyond the reach of mortal control. By December of 1770, Lafayette County was quiet with the hush of winter, but the stillness over the Hargrove estate carried a weight far heavier than snow or frost. The tobacco fields, once green and promising, were now skeletal, blackened stalks protruding from cracked soil. The estate had become a ghost of its former grandeur, a place where whispers, shadows, and fear held dominion. Colonel Thaddeus Hargrove, once proud and feared, had become a shell of a man. He no longer walked with the authority of a plantation master, but shuffled through the halls like one haunted by the constant gaze of the past. Nights brought no relief. He could hear Eleanor's voice carried by the wind, see her spectral figure among the ruins of the fields, and feel her presence in every cold draught that cut through the manor. The local community, once curious and then fearful, had begun to avoid the Hargrove estate entirely. Even clergy who had offered blessings and prayers left shaken, recounting tales of shadows that moved against the light, doors that refused to stay closed, and furniture that seemed to dance to a rhythm known only to the unseen. The whispers of Eleanor's curse grew louder with each passing week, spreading across neighboring plantations and taverns, until the Hargrove name itself became synonymous with ruin and supernatural vengeance. Colonel Hargrove attempted one last act of control. He sought to leave Lafayette County, hoping to abandon the estate and escape the consequences of his cruelty. But every plan failed. Carriages broke down inexplicably, horses refused to move, and sudden storms forced him back into the heart of the cursed land. It became evident to him, as stark as the winter moon above, that Eleanor's power was not confined to sight or speech. It was bound to the land, to the very soul of the plantation. Eleanor, however, showed no malice beyond what justice required. She did not pursue the colonel with anger, nor did she inflict harm upon those who sought only to leave the estate peacefully. Instead, she embodied the consequences of cruelty, a living, or perhaps spectral, reminder that actions born of selfishness and disregard for human dignity exact a toll. The field hands, many of whom had once feared her, now treated her with reverence and caution, acknowledging that the land itself obeyed her will. Stories began to circulate of those who attempted to cross her or mock her presence. Crops would shrivel, tools would break, and sometimes the very soil beneath their feet seemed to give way. Conversely, those who approached Eleanor with humility, kindness, or remorse found the fields strangely forgiving. Tobacco, while never returning to its former glory, would occasionally bloom in patches under careful care, almost as if she allowed a measure of growth as reward for respect shown to her and to the land. The colonel's decline accelerated. Once a man of rigid discipline, he now wandered the halls talking to shadows, consumed by guilt and fear. Servants who had remained loyal began to flee, unable to endure the oppressive atmosphere. His attempts to enlist help from neighbors or authorities were met with skepticism, or more often avoidance, as the legend of Eleanor's curse had grown too potent. By the early months of 1771, the Hargrove estate had effectively become a prison, not for Eleanor, but for the man who had once sought to control everything around him. Eleanor's influence endured beyond Thaddeus Hargrove's lifetime. Even after his death, which some claimed occurred under mysterious circumstances in the cold of a January night, the Lafayette tobacco fields remained partially blighted. Traders refused to touch the land without assurances, and generations of local residents spoke of the whispered hex of Lafayette, the story of a sister wronged and the brother undone by his own cruelty. The legacy of Eleanor Hargrove, once frail and ill, transformed into a legend of justice and vengeance. She became a figure of cautionary tales, a spectral embodiment of the moral that cruelty cannot be contained and that injustice, once inflicted, returns in ways both subtle and terrifying. Over time, the Hargrove estate was abandoned. Nature slowly reclaimed the land, though patches of scorched earth persisted, a physical reminder of the events of 1770. Travelers spoke of strange lights flickering through the trees at night, shadows moving where no one walked, and a pale woman seen wandering among the remnants of the tobacco fields. It was said that she watched over the land still, ensuring that the memory of cruelty remained etched into the soil, and that the balance of justice could never be forgotten. Even centuries later, the story of Colonel Thaddeus Hargrove and his sister Elena serves as a chilling testament to the consequences of human greed and malice. The whispers of Lafayette persist in local lore, a haunting reminder that some debts are not paid with money and some wrongs cannot be erased. In the fertile fields of Virginia, where tobacco once promised wealth and prosperity, the legacy of a cruel auction and a whispered hex endures, a historical true crime that blurs the line between reality and legend, leaving those who hear it with an uneasy sense of moral reckoning. And so, the tale concludes, a story of a man undone by ambition, a sister transformed by injustice, and a land scorched by the inexorable force of retribution. The Lafayette tobacco fields, once vibrant and alive, stand as silent witnesses to the cost of cruelty, echoing through time with the whispers of vengeance that no mortal could hope to silence.